Hello, everybody. It's time to talk about taxes and elasticity. But before we get started, let me say a couple of things. First of all, the FRQ homework that I assigned to you yesterday is on Edsby. You can go in and check your answers. So make sure you do that. Make sure that you are answering them correctly because you'll have an FRQ on your test on Wednesday. The second thing I want to say is I want you to pause the video for just a moment. Whoever turned the video on, just hang out by the laptop because I may have you pause it from time to time. Go ahead and pause the video for just a moment, and I want everybody to go and label all three of these graphs. Put the quantity and the price, demand, supply, and then the supply curve above it is going to be S sub T, right? Because that represents our tax. So take a moment and do that, please. Okay, now you should have everything labeled. Now I'm going to focus on that first graph, but before I do that, I just want to point out that all of these graphs are designed to be very, very similar. The supply curves are identical in all three, all right? The only difference here is the demand curve. You'll notice this is just a normal downward sloping demand curve. This is a flatter demand curve, and this is a steeper demand curve. So if you haven't already figured it out, why do I have these different looks on the demand curve? Well, our topic today is taxes and elasticity, and sure enough, we're looking at what happens as the elasticity of the demand changes, okay? So let's start off by focusing on just this first graph, and I'm going to do just something that we've already looked at a few times, and that is what happens when there's an excise tax, right? This is still just an excise tax or a per unit tax put on the supplier. All right, now if you'll remember what I said the other day was what's really important to understand about this is that even though this tax appears to only affect the supplier, right, this vertical shift right here represents that tax, but the tax always ends up being shared by the consumer and the supplier because this demand curve is sloped. That means that when we go from our equilibrium price and quantity to our new taxed price and quantity, we don't go straight up, which is the tax is a vertical shift. We don't go straight up, we follow the demand curve to this new point, and so some of the cost is always borne by the consumer as well as the supplier. Another thing is we ask the question, what is the eventual price that the supplier gets? Right, they were getting this equilibrium price, and now they're getting, well, the consumer is paying the tax price, but the supplier doesn't get this price, right? Because they have to take off the $2 of tax before they get to it, and so they actually get this price down here. I'm going to mark this, and I think I'm going to call it P sub S to represent the price to the supplier. Now, in this particular graph, it didn't come out perfectly, but this portion up here, and I'll highlight that in the purple. That represents the portion of the tax paid by consumer. Tax paid by the consumer. And then below that, this region right here, that is the portion of the tax that's paid by supplier. I'll admit I maybe didn't draw my lines too great, but these are pretty close to even. It looks like the way I've drawn this, the consumer is paying a little bit more of it than the supplier is, okay? But this is how the tax gets split up. This is the portion paid by the consumer, this is the portion paid by the supplier. So now what we're going to do is we're going to leave the supply curves all alone, and we're going to shift this demand curve. So let's now look at this second curve, the second set of lines. And we're going to do the exact same analysis. All right, so take just a moment, and just like up here, we marked our equilibrium quantity and price, and our tax quantity and price, and our supplier price. So take a moment and stop the video for a second and label your graph accordingly. Put all these same labels on your graph. Okay, so I've got my labels here. This is my equilibrium quantity and price. Here's my taxed quantity and price. And then this is the price that goes to the supplier. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to highlight the portion that is the consumer portion of the tax. So that's that region right there. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the supplier portion of the tax. And as you look at this and compare it to the previous graph, it's hopefully a little obvious that the supplier is paying a bigger chunk than before. And that actually makes sense. If you recall, if you have a flatter demand graph, does that mean that demand is more elastic or more inelastic than our previous graph? Right, well, hopefully you said it was more elastic, right? We see a big change in quantity here, and that's because our graph is fairly flat. Our demand curve is fairly flat. And so I'm going to describe this thing as being more elastic demand. And by more elastic, all I really mean, I don't want to overcomplicate this, I just mean that it is more elastic than the first graph that we did, right? Elasticity is related to slope, but it's not just slope, it's more than that. So we can't really talk about saying this is just elastic, but it is definitely more elastic than this previous demand curve. And so let's talk about what kind of conclusions we can draw. That when you have an excise tax and a more elastic demand, the supplier will pay a larger portion of the tax. And I'll say tax burden. And if you think about what it means to have elastic demand, this makes sense because the tax causes the price of the product to go up. And with elastic demand, if the price of the product goes up, quantity demand drops dramatically, right? We see this big drop in quantity. So that means that the producer is selling a lot fewer items. And so that tax plays a bigger role in the overall cost to them. So they pay a larger portion of the tax burden, all right? That is with more elastic demand. All right, let's move on to our next example. And you can probably already predict where this is going. But go ahead and pause the video for just a moment and label all of your points just like you did before. Okay, we've now got all of our labels up, and in this case we're looking at a steeper demand curve, so we would describe this as being more inelastic demand compared to our first example, right? This is more inelastic than our first example. And you can probably already see it before we color it in, that the portion that now is paid by the consumer has gotten a lot larger, right? Here is this. My highlighter is going to run out of ink. And then here is the portion paid by the producer, which is a lot smaller, right? And so what we can conclude here is that when you have a more inelastic demand, the consumer will pay a larger portion of the burden. More inelastic demand, the consumer will pay a larger portion of the tax burden. So these are important ideas. These are ideas that will get tested and you'll be asked about. And I don't really expect you guys to memorize this stuff. What I expect is that you know what inelastic demand looks like. You know that it is a steep demand curve, and that you could sketch yourself a very quick example and look at these two different areas and conclude, oh, the consumer pays more, their portion is bigger. This comes through practice, so when you get asked questions like this, you need to sketch out a graph, practice it, and make sure you know how to do it on your own without having to look back at notes, right? That's how this works, is with an inelastic demand, the consumer will pay a larger portion. With an elastic demand, the producer pays a larger portion. And that's basically it. You just need to be able to keep that straight so that you can answer the questions in the FRQs that you're going to see. Now, if you turn the page, you'll see a couple of FRQs here. Right? There's one at the top and one at the bottom. These two FRQs I want you to do in class and for homework. So make sure you have those ready by Monday. All right? You all have a good weekend.